Coming up on Paris on Politics.
Biden on the defensive after rocky debate performance has some Democrats saying he should step aside.
But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth.
We do a deep dive into one of the most watched presidential debates in history.
My son was not a loser, he was not a sucker. You're the sucker, you're the loser.
Why Ed Burke was sentenced to only 2 years in prison. Paris on Politics is next.
This is Paris on Politics from Fox Chicago.
Thank you for joining us, Chicago. This is Paris on Politics. I'm Paris Schutz. Each week, we bring you analysis of the biggest political stories, whether they come from the back rooms of City Hall or out on the street in the neighborhoods. But tonight, we start with the debate scene around the world. Some Democrats today reportedly in panic mode and calling on Joe Biden to step aside before the Democratic National Convention. The president made it clear today he intends to stick it out. President Biden appearing confused and struggling through a cold that caused a weak voice.
Dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Trump blustering and making big claims, many divorced from reality.
On January 6th, we were respected all over the world. All over the world, we were respected.
Independent voters irritated and confused.
I think I speak for a lot of Americans when I say I have, from both sides, absolute anxiety about this.
Enough, says a blistering Chicago Tribune editorial today, calling both candidates clowns. The paper making clear it's time for Biden to step aside. Quote, he should announce that he will be a single-term president who now has seen the light when it comes to his own capabilities in the face of singular demands of being the president of the United States. But replacing a candidate after all states have voted in a primary is no easy task, says Northwestern University political scientist Tabitha Bonilla.
I think it would be incredibly unlikely. I think it would take a lot of coordination across delegates to agree on who the candidate could be or the alternative candidate could be. And it's just so unprecedented in a year where we have an incumbent who does not want to step down.
Even Biden's staunchest Illinois supporters couldn't spin the performance as a success, but they're urging naysayers to give him another chance.
For us to decide today whether or not that can continue, I think is really premature. So I think everybody's got to take a deep breath and watch and see how things proceed.
But Republicans wasting no time piling on.
It was sad. It was sad to watch. This is dangerous to put this on display for the country.
At a campaign rally today, Biden tried to change the narrative.
I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smooth as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth.
Bonilla says attention spans are short and there's a lot of time left.
Everything is fluid until we hit Election Day, or at least early voting. So I think the needle might move in many directions between now and then.
I spoke to two Democratic Illinois congresspeople about Biden's performance. First, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, and second, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. I began by asking Krishnamurthy if he echoed some of the concerns he's hearing in the party.
Definitely concerns about the weak start. I think that he ended up doing better as the debate went on. I think that one comment I got on my text messages was, man, Trump is not wearing well through the debate with the repeated misrepresentations and so forth. So I'm sure there's going to be a little bit of fact checking. And so we'll see what happens on day 2 of this debate coverage.
Everybody has a bad day, and now we're all going to have an opportunity to see Joe Biden going out on the stump. He's going to be meeting with constituents around the country starting today. He's going to be talking. So, I think we have to understand this. The fundamental problem right now, and that we're facing in this country, is that this is a turning point on whether we have fascism or freedom. And Donald Trump exposed himself in every single way, as he always has, and he didn't answer the questions. He would not say whether or not he would respect the decision of the next president of the United States, even though he was asked 3 times.
And we asked each of Illinois' 3 Republican congresspeople to weigh in, but they declined our offer. So last night, instead, I spoke with former Illinois state rep and firebrand candidate for governor Jeannie Ives, who said she believed there was a clear winner.
I was really concerned, and I think most people were, when Biden first walked out, and he almost looked right at that moment that he was unaware of his surroundings. And then he really kind of fumbled through the beginning. Now, we all admit here, and people that were watching with us, he seemed to get a little bit stronger. Yet he had those moments where he simply just stared off. And to CNN's credit, they kept the video on him, where he just seemed to have this blank stare about him. I don't think that gives people a lot of confidence at all in him as a president. And so I thought it was pretty disastrous for him on the physical level.
And for more analysis, we're joined by veteran Chicago political reporters who have umpteen conventions between the two of them. Mike Flannery, former political editor here at Fox 32, and Derek Blakely, former political editor at CBS 2. We're going to call this the alumni panel. What do you think?
Sounds good. Sounds good to me.
All right, Mike Flannery, Biden staunchly rejecting calls to step aside today. Do you see any universe where he accedes to some of these concerns and hands over the baton before the convention?
For the first time after last night's performance, I do think it's possible. I think it's very unlikely. Biden is in charge. There are only, there's a relative, very tiny number of uncommitted delegates who are not controlled by Biden on that first ballot. And I just think it's too complicated and it's too late for Democrats to make a switch. But for the first time, I think it's possible.
Well, the only way I think it'll happen is if you get a congressional delegation, Democratic wise men who go to Biden and say, hey, you've got to do this. Similar to the Republicans who went to Richard Nixon and told him he had to step aside during Watergate. That's a long shot. It is not likely. But again, for the first time, it is possible because they see what the whole country saw. And there is no way that you can say this was an off night or he was just off his game. He was simply showing his age and his decline in his faculties.
And I agree with that. If I could just add 2 names. I think the first name is Barack Obama.
I was just going to say that.
And the second name is Bill Clinton. But especially,
I was going to say Dr. Jill Biden.
And especially Barack Obama. Should former President Obama go to Biden and say, Joe, you got to go, I think that might be enough.
So what would that process be to replace him? Would it be a brokered convention like 1968 where delegates would fight among themselves about where they're going to go?
It could turn out to be a number of scenarios because you're in uncharted waters after the presumed nominee, who's also a sitting president, sits down so late in the process. But, another thing I was thinking about watching the debate is we have kind of sloughed off these debates and they had kind of declined in importance. This debate will go down as the most important debate since the first Kennedy-Nixon debate because it is going to have a profound effect on this campaign.
We're talking about 1960 on WBBM.
Exactly.
You're right here in Chicago.
Right here in Chicago.
Right.
Yeah. So, I agree with that. This was a hugely consequential debate. There's another one scheduled in September, which might well surpass it should it come to be.
But if you're Donald Trump, why would you even take part in that? You wiped the floor with him last night. You have nothing to gain.
I mean, that's a good point.
Biden has everything to gain. He wants another shot at
here's the other problem. Here's the other problem with trying to broker some new candidate. There's an incumbent vice president, Kamala Harris, the first black woman vice president. And I hear this talk about J.B. Pritzker or Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, or the man in the moon. Does anybody think that supporters of Kamala Harris and many African-American key Democrats are going to just say, well, wait a minute, yeah, let's push Kamala Harris aside? Now, I don't think that's likely.
Clearly, there will be tons of infighting in different factions. But Derek Blakely, we know attention spans are short. Sometimes things happen and 2 weeks later, everyone forgets about it. Is there any coming back from this if you're Joe Biden?
Is there a de-aging process like Martin Scorsese used in that movie, The Irishman? This is a very serious problem. This is the future of the country, and this is the future leader of the country and the current leader. And he just did not look like he had enough gas to make it through the next 4 years. Now, he could change that perception and maybe change it into a perception of wisdom as opposed to age, but it's going to be tough.
And you know, here's the other thing. The Electoral College tilts in favor of the Republicans, and many people aren't aware of this because Biden won a substantial victory in the Electoral College.
He needs to win by 3 or 4% in the popular vote.
If he flips, if 80,000 voters 4 years ago had flipped from Biden to Trump, Trump would have won the Electoral College. You know, in Georgia, in Arizona, you know, Wisconsin. I mean, it's under 100,000 voters flip, and Trump gets reelected.
It's a sliver of a vote. But Derek, at the same time, sure, you have Biden stumbles and his appearance, but then you have Trump making these hyperbolic claims, and that's to be generous. I mean, many of them out-and-out lies. Do independent voters respond to that?
It wasn't that Trump did so well. It was that Biden did so poorly. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. Trump, as you mentioned, continued his fabrications about the election and the economy and a lot of other things. Biden, at some point, made some good points about policy, but he just looked like a person who wasn't able to hold the office, and that kind of overshadowed everything he was saying.
All right.
And that's the problem.
Guys, stay right there because you're not done yet. We want to talk about Ed Burke, but that's going to be a bit later in the show, so hang tight. We will be right back after this, and don't go away.
Up next on Paris on Politics.
Why Ed Burke only got 2 years in prison and the inside story about his rise to power.
Chicago Sports Insiders.
I am so excited. This is gold right now. It's gold.
Streaming now on your smart TV at Fox 32 on Fox Local, your home of the Bears team.
Every Bears game will be must-see TV.
Following every step of a historic season.
Hardcore on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Download Fox Local and get in the game now.
Touchdown, Bears!
Search Fox Local on these streaming platforms and start watching today.
And another felonious politician took center stage in Chicago this week. 50-year former alderman Ed Burke. Prosecutors had asked for 10 years for his crimes, but a federal judge settled on only 2 years after being visibly moved by the outpouring of letters she received from supporters who begged her for mercy because of Burke's lifetime of charitable acts. It was a starkly softer image that his defense team attempted to portray for a convicted criminal.
The formerly loquacious Finance Committee chairman was a man of few words today as he left the federal courthouse building with his wife, former Illinois Supreme Court Chief Justice Ann Burke.
Back up. Excuse me, gentlemen.
Burke was similarly brief in his comments before federal judge Virginia Kendall, taking some responsibility for his conviction, but stopping short of admitting guilt. Quote, "The blame for this is mine and mine alone. I regret the pain and sorrow that I have caused my family and friends, and I would ask your honor to have compassion and mercy." After more than 5 hours of defense and prosecution arguments, Judge Kendall said his crimes were serious. Quote, "What happens when a public official acts in favor of himself rather than the public?" the judge asked from the bench. "That's when citizens lose faith in their public officials, in the belief that those elected officials will represent them." But Kendall clearly did show mercy, offering a sentence that fell far short of the guideline range of between 6.5 and 8 years. Kendall said she had never seen the sheer volume of letters in support of Burke and the good deeds that he'd done. And she noted Burke's advanced age, 80 years old, with recent health struggles.
This was a lighter sentence than was anticipated. I do think you had a situation where the judge was balancing very serious public corruption with this outpouring of support.
And the judge poured cold water on the prosecution's contention that a long sentence was needed to deter future corruption, noting that former Alderman Danny Solis will serve no punishment for his legal troubles. That's because he performed ably as government mole, ensnaring Burke in numerous recorded conversations where Burke attempted to use his powerful city position to make money for his law firm.
While you're at it, recommend the good firm of Crafter and Burke to do the tax work.
All right, I certainly will.
And we can certainly talk about a marketing arrangement for you.
Burke's family, wife, 4 children and grandchildren were on hand during today's hearing and processed the news with mixed emotions. On top of Burke's 2-year sentence, he gets 1 year of supervised release and faces $2 million in fines.
And we're joined now by two experts on all things Ed Burke, Joe Ferguson, president of the Civic Federation, a nonpartisan fiscal watchdog. Mr. Ferguson is the city's former inspector general who was part of Burke's investigation. Ferguson is also a former federal prosecutor. And Michelle Smith, former 43rd Ward alderwoman, chair of City Council's Ethics Committee, and also a former federal prosecutor. Great to have both of you here. Joe Ferguson, prosecutors wanted 10 years. The revised guidelines were for 6 to 8 years. The judge chose 2 years. Were you surprised?
I was surprised, yeah. And to be perfectly candid about this, I was a little angry in the first instance. The first thing you have to remember is the judge is not supposed to be doing this from an emotional place. Trying to think this through, I had to step back and process why I was angry. And what I came to was this just didn't feel like it landed in the right place for the larger community. There are 4 factors that go into sentencing. One is incapacitation, another rehabilitation, another deterrence, and the final one is retribution. Only retribution is punishment, and that's where you get all of these individual factors that get brought to bear. But I think this sentence falls short of the deterrence component of this. When you have a situation as reported in the news where the end of sentencing brought 2 metrics that are very telling, smiles and hugs among the defense team and the defendant, and the category of stakeholders most pleased with the balancing here were aldermen. And that tells me that for all the considerations of age and other things, good deeds in the community, service over time, 2 years has some sense to it. But if that's the reaction of the defendant, and if that's the reaction of the defendant's colleagues, maybe deterrence wasn't quite served.
Yeah, clearly aldermen saying, well, maybe the punishment isn't so bad if we engage in these kind of activities. Michelle Smith, 2 years, had you hoped for more than that?
Absolutely. You know, Ed didn't, Alderman Burke didn't walk into these crimes without a background. And he wouldn't have said the things he said on tape if he hadn't been so confident in his ability to get what he wanted or to try to get what he wanted. So he comes at this with a background of power and well-known abuses of power. So 2 years, to me, almost is a reward.
And the judge was saying, well, I can only sentence based on what was laid out in the trial, which was a couple years of bad activities, although she was able to consider 50 years of his good deeds. A bit of an imbalance there?
A bit of an imbalance. I think it was probably an overstatement in the moment to say I can't consider anything except the conduct of conviction in the context of a sentencing process that actually brings to bear all of the community factors, all of the personal history, all of the professional history. That sounded to me like an exit strategy for the judge in the moment.
Michelle Smith, you told a really interesting story when you were running for office and you met Ed Burke, and he kind of low-key issued some sort of threat to you to basically stay in line. Tell us what happened there.
Well, in 2007, when I was running, I was introduced to Alderman Burke and told I should talk to him because I was a brand new candidate. So I did. And after a pretty typical political discussion, asking how I would win and things like that, he dropped his voice and said something to me that he only could have known if he actually looked at my divorce file. And that sent a shudder through me, and I realized that this was a man I needed to avoid, in general.
Was that a sign of him saying, don't cross me or else some bad thing's going to come out?
I certainly took it as a guy who says, I know something about you. And it wasn't even about me, it was about my daughter. So I know something. And that's pretty attempt to be chilling. So I just decided that when someone tries to pull something like that, it's not going to intimidate me, but I'm sure not going to make him my friend. And he was, of course, a colleague, but we were on opposite sides of many, many issues, particularly the creation of the Independent Inspector General's office. And I didn't really interact with him any more than I should have. And I guess the last thing I'll say is he was known for both being good and somewhat threatening, as you heard on the tapes. But all those letters that he got from people, which I'm going to assume were completely sincere, are certainly a collection of a bunch of IOUs from many, many years.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the way he operated. He did good things, and he collected those chits and those favors, not unlike we've seen portrayed in movies about mobsters. But Joe Ferguson, as Inspector General, you tussled with Ed Burke because he desperately did not want your office to have to oversee aldermen. I covered that for many years. It was a fun and amusing back and forth. Eventually, your office did have jurisdiction over him. You were involved in this investigation. Tell us how it started or what you can say about it.
Not much about the investigation itself. I will tell you this. Ed Burke was the one alderman of the old school variety that understood exactly where I was going and trying to go as Inspector General. And he threw everything he could in the way of it actually happening, including some really old school last minute vote sort of swapping and arrangements to block it the first time. And I have a bit of a more subtle story than Michelle offered here, which I don't think I've said publicly.
All right, we have an exclusive
so there
here.
you go.
Okay.
Is very early in my term, Ed called me to his finance committee offices, which really are the grandest offices that exist in City Hall.
Yeah.
In City Council, in City Hall. There's guards outside, you wait, it's 30-foot ceilings, it's appointed with all sorts of things from history. And we had a conversation, and he wanted to talk about things that maybe should be done. And it was a long conversation, and about 2/3 of the way into it, he said to me, "A fellow like you must think about becoming a judge someday." And
we know Ed Burke had to bless all the folks wanting to become judge. They had to go through him. Joe Ferguson, Michelle Smith, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Up next on Paris on Politics.
Our alumni panel tackles Ed Burke.
In Chicago, a politician who goes into court is presumed guilty by the jury.
How did the leader of a small village become known as the worst mayor in America?
She cannot continue to intimidate and gangster her way through this.
From showy billboards and expensive police bodyguards to Vegas trips and retaliation allegations, we bring you an inside look into Mayor Tiffany Henyard and the drama in Dalton. Streaming now at Fox 32 on Fox Local. Search Fox Local on these streaming platforms. Download and watch today.
And now we're back with our alumni panel of Mike Flannery and Derek Blakely. We want to continue the Burke discussion. Derek, you were in court on Monday. What was your reaction when that sentence was read off, and what was it like in the courtroom?
Well, there's no doubt that Burke caught a break. I mean, the prosecutors wanted to give him 10 years. The sentencing guidelines called for 6 years. Federal Judge Virginia Kendall very smilingly looked upon him and gave him 2 years and a $2 million fine. Now, to be sure, I would not want to be 80 years old and going to a federal prison for the better part of 2 years. But compared to what he could have gotten, he definitely was looked on very favorably by the judge.
And this saintly picture that the judge painted based on this outpouring of letters that she received is in stark contrast to the Ed Burke perhaps you and other political reporters observed in City Council, especially going back to council wars. Mike, two different sides of this very complicated man.
Well, there were more than two different sides. There were many multiple sides, Paris. But he was, Burke understood the personal element in politics. Even during council wars, he was the co-leader of the Verdoliak 29. Even during then, he often reached out to Harold Washington supporters and did personal favors for them, helped them with things with assistance that they needed. And, there were some of them, even you think about how bitter those public clashes were, some of them will, even after this conviction, told me nice things about Burke. And in 50-plus years in public life, he undeniably did things that were good for the city. He absolutely caught a break, but that was Dan Mialopoulos in the Sun-Times and WBEZ captured the essence of Burke's being aware of this side of things. He recalled staking Burke out on a very cold day outside his home, and Burke ends up giving him a cap. to help him get warm.
I actually think I got one of those Chicago knitted caps from Burke, too. Actually, he gave me earmuffs one time. Derek Blakely, now we've got the Mike Madigan trial coming up. We've got the Supreme Court ruling this week that could vastly change that. What do you predict for Madigan going forward?
Well, I'd predict a guilty verdict because almost everyone who goes into federal court winds up with a guilty verdict. But how that verdict will be affected by the Supreme Court ruling is kind of up in the air.
And it seems like they're going to have to narrow the case down because what the Supreme Court, we should remind viewers, they're ruling that certain gifts and gratuities from contractors doing business with government are okay as long as you didn't get caught on tape saying X for Y.
Or you take the money after the deed, not before. Right. Why that's germane, I'm not sure.
Madigan faces 23 counts. 5 of those counts involve the so-called 666 statute, section of the law, and they may well be dropped. The judge in that case still wants Madigan's trial to begin in October. But look, here's the reality. You and I have covered many of these things over the past 50 years, Derek, and in Chicago, a politician who goes into court is presumed guilty by the jury. No matter what the U.S. Constitution says, a politician facing corruption charges in Chicago is presumed guilty until he proves himself innocent. That's why at the end of the ComEd 4 trial, a woman in that ComEd 4 jury said, we all told reporters, and we all wish that Mike Madigan had been included in these charges because we wanted to convict him too.
But here's the thing about that Supreme Court ruling. It looks like that ComEd verdict has a very good chance of being thrown out, and at the very least, they would retry that case because of what happened in the Supreme Court. Guys, we got to leave it there, but you guys still have a lot to say, so we're going to make this a regular thing if you're good with it. The alumni panel, hope you guys come back. Thanks very much. Great seeing you. But for now, enjoy your weekend. So long, everyone.
Fox 32's photographers share the stories they've captured with you. See Chicago through their unique lens. July 4th at 6:30 on Fox 32.